We can all remember a time when we first saw a lightsaber battle on the big screen and thought to ourselves, hell yeah. Well, at least that's what I thought back as a 7-year-old in 2005, watching Revenge of the Sith on the big screen and getting absolutely traumatized. But little did we know as Star Wars fans how much history and lore actually was behind all of the different styles of lightsaber combat, and once I went down that rabbit hole, man, there was no going back. What's up guys, it's your boy Lordology here, and in today's video, I wanted to do something much more lore orientated, where I give my thoughts on and discuss all of the forms of lightsaber combat and rank them from worst to best. I also want to preface this by saying that I'll be putting my focus on the mainline 7 forms and their variants, and not any of the forbidden forms like Trikada or Form 8 Kendosu, which I'll have to cover in a different video. I also need to mention that I'll be drawing on and explaining the lore of Star Wars Legends in regards to the 7 forms. Of course, this video is going to be quite subjective as I do have bias towards certain characters and the way that they fight with their lightsabers, but I will be drawing on several sources to display my points, and I'll be using modded gameplay of Star Wars Battlefront 2 and my interpretation of all the forms in game, as well as using several different scenes from across the Star Wars universe, like the movies and animated shows, to best convey my points. And with that being said, I hope you guys enjoy this lore dive into the lightsaber combat styles of Star Wars, and let's jump straight into it. Now, coming in 8th position, and arguably my least favourite lightsaber form, is Form 6 Naman, which is referred to by several different terms, such as the Way of the Rancor and the Diplomat's form, but amongst most Star Wars fans, it's commonly known as the Moderation form. Now, this form isn't necessarily bad by any means, since there's two well-known practitioners of this form in Star Wars Legends, which are Exar Kun, who was a Dark Lord of the Sith during the old Sith Wars, and the second being the clone of Galen Marek known as Starkiller in the video game Force Unleashed 2. It's a common misconception that Galen from the first game was a practitioner of Form 6, but he primarily made use of Forms 3, 5 and 7, unlike his clone in the second game, which made use of more force-orientated powers and combos, which is a staple of Form 6 combat. Form 6, as Jedi Master Sindralik says, and I quote, "It is often referred to as the Diplomat's form, because it is less intensive in its demands than other disciplines, allowing Jedi to spend more time developing their skills in perception, political strategy, and negotiation." End quote. Form 6 is essentially a hybrid form that incorporates Forms 1 through 5 with a general understanding of all forms, but no specialization in any of them. This makes Form 6 known as the Jack of all trades form, and because of the relaxed focus on blade work, many Naman practitioners tend to incorporate the use of force powers in their style to make up for the lack of specialization, which honestly, the use of force powers in combat is my favorite aspect of this form, but generally it's considered to be the weakest form, especially during the Battle of Geonosis, where all of the practitioners of Form 6 ended up being killed, including Sarisa Jeng, Sa Labuda, and Joclad Danva, mostly because Form 6 wasn't well suited to open battlefields and dueling, since the greatest threat to the style of Form 6 is Form 2 users such as Count Dooku. Now, I do need to make mention of Jar Kai, which is basically the blanket term for dual-wielding lightsaber users, but generally all practitioners of Jar Kai need to study Form 6 in some way, since dual-bladed combat originates from this form. Form 4 was another form that did incorporate dual blades into its fighting style, and it is quite popular with the former Jedi Ahsoka Tano, who made use of Jar Kai, and was quite familiar with Form 6. Overall, Form 6 does have some interesting aspects to it with force-assisted attacks, but compared to the other forms, it kind of falls flat since the success of this form is more based on the practitioner's ability to be intuitive and creative in combat, rather than it being suited for dueling and open combat situations. Coming in 7th position, and most likely the most controversial position on this list, is the Julio variant of Form 7, which is referred to as the Way of the Vornsk, and it's commonly known as the Ferocity form, and is the most vicious style of all the forms of lightsaber combat. Now, just like Form 6, Form 7 isn't bad by any means, and can be considered as one of the most badass forms, and some of the most notable practitioners of this form are characters like Darth Sidious, who was also a master in all 7 variants of lightsaber combat, and of course the most well-known user of Form 7, that being Darth Maul, who made use of the form during the Duel of the Fates against Jedi's Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Form 7, as Darth Traya says, and I quote, "In many ways, some have described it as a surrender to the Force and to chaos. To strike at an opponent with such speed and angles of attack that they have difficulty countering it, but in surrendering yourself to the Force in such a way, reduces your ability to resist its effects, should the enemy turn the Force against you. Be on your guard." End quote. Form 7, as I stated before, is known as the most vicious form of lightsaber combat, and the form was considered as one of the most demanding and hardest to learn for its unpredictability. Generally, Form 7 is best used on single opponents to completely overwhelm them, just like how Darth Maul overwhelms Qui-Gon Jinn in The Phantom Menace, which shows how efficient this form can be. And many Jedi refer to the 7th form as a violation of a specific aspect of the Jedi Code, being, there is no emotion, there is peace. Since Form 7 required the user to surrender to the Force and their emotions, which can be very difficult for a Jedi to overcome, and Darth Sidious was even so bold as to state that Form 7 is the Sith style of lightsaber combat. One of the main weaknesses of Juyo is that it leaves users exposed for giving themselves over to the Force in such a way, which means defensively this form is found to be quite lacking, and Juyo is best utilized against single opponents as the ferocious nature of the form is spread too thin when engaging multiple opponents. Overall, Form 7 is a pretty cool form that is primarily used by dark side users for its emphasis on ferocious attacks and giving in to both the Force and the user's emotions, but because of its clear weakness against multiple targets and its over-reliance on attacking constantly is why I rank it 7th on this list. Now coming in at number 6 is Form 3 Soresu, which is referred to as the Way of the Minnock and commonly known as the Resilience form. This lightsaber form is quite commonly used by the Jedi, which was the most popular form that the Jedi used during the Clone Wars, and was created originally as an extension of Form 1 as a way to combat the emergence of blasters, and some of the well-known practitioners of Soresu include Barriss Offee, Luminara Unduli, the apprentice of Darth Bane being Darth Zana, and arguably the most well-known user and master of Soresu, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Form 3 has differing opinions amongst powerful Force users, with Sindralik having more of a positive view of Soresu and saying, and I quote, "This form maximizes defensive protection in a style characterized by tight, efficient movements that expose minimal target areas when compared with the relatively open styles of some other forms." End quote. Now in comparison to a dark side user's view like Darth Traya is quite different, as she says, and I quote, "A different technique, but effective. Use it if you do not wish to be hit, or if you are facing many opponents with blasters. With a lightsaber blade and enough skill in deflection, it is an excellent offense against blasters, but in other situations, it merely delays the inevitable." End quote. Form 3, among all things, is focused on defense above all else, and this can be seen as both a positive and negative. Soresu can be characterized by making use of tight moves with dodges and parries to have the most defensive coverage, and because of the tight motions of this form and the little energy used, made masters of the form basically untouchable by both lightsaber attacks and blaster fire. One of the best examples of a master of Soresu at work is in the Anakin Skywalker vs Obi-Wan Kenobi fight on Mustafar, where Obi-Wan displayed one of the best showcases of Soresu on screen, with Obi-Wan being right in the center of Anakin's barrage of attacks, which is known as being in the Eye of the Storm, which amongst Soresu users is a core tenet of the form, but even with its superior defensive capabilities, Soresu lacks any offensive response and relies on waiting out the opponent and holding back to prolong the fight until the attacker becomes frustrated or fatigued, which is when a Soresu practitioner will take advantage, but above all else, Form 3 is about survival and not victory. One of the main weaknesses of Form 3 is the mindset of users thinking that they were invincible with an impenetrable defense, which just isn't true. Soresu was not reliable at taking down skilled opponents who could maintain a controlled offensive attack, which Anakin demonstrated quite well on Mustafar, since there was no possible way that Obi-Wan would have been able to continue to defend against Anakin's onslaught, as he left very few openings in his attacks, which wore down Obi-Wan, and if not for Anakin's own arrogance, he would have beaten Obi-Wan had the fight gone on any longer. Form 3 tended to be quite ineffective against Form 2 users, with the examples of Obi-Wan being beaten by Count Dooku twice due to his superior footwork and positioning in battle against lightsaber and Force users, and Luminara Unduli being beaten by the Sith assassin Asajj Ventress, who is also another practitioner of Form 2 and showcases that Soresu in many ways can be ineffective. Overall, Form 3 is a pretty sweet form since it's used by one of the best characters in Star Wars being Obi-Wan Kenobi, and its emphasis on defense and tight blade work make it quite an effective form if the goal of the user is to prioritize survival over victory. And even though this form is quite useful, I personally am not a fan of its over-reliance on defense and prolonging combat against skilled force users, which can be quite risky, and one little mistake could cost you, which is why I rank this form 6th on my list. Coming in at number 5, and what I consider to be the most underrated of all lightsaber forms, is Form 1 Shi-Cho, known as the Way of the Sarlacc, and commonly referred to as the Determination form. Of all the forms, it is a requirement for all younglings and Padawans to have a basic understanding of Shi-Cho, but it is actually quite rare for there to be masters of the form due to the raw and wild emotions of the form, and Obi-Wan was one who cautioned against it when talking to Jedi Master Kit Fisto, and describes watching masters of Shi-Cho like watching water flow over the falls. Some of the most well-known users of Form 1 include Kento Marek, the father of Starkiller, and Jedi Master Kit Fisto, who is the most prolific user of Shi-Cho. Form 1 is described from two differing views by Sindralik, and he says, and I quote, "Form 1, also called Shi-Cho, requires little explanation, as every Jedi youngling learns the basics of attack, parry, body target zones, and practice drills called velocities. Form 1 was created by the ancient Jedi during the transition from metal swords to energy beam lightsabers, and the principles of blade contact remain essentially the same." End quote. And Sindralik also calls out the negative aspect of the form by saying, and I quote, "Because the ancient Jedi did not have lightsaber wielding enemies, Form 1 does not address the lightsaber to lightsaber combat." End quote. Form 1 is very much known for the studies of basic attacks, parrying, and body target zones, but in the hands of a master of the form, it is described as fostering an emotionally heated mindset, which would bring users to the brink of wanting to kill their opponents, even though the form's main function is to disarm opponents. It's against multiple enemies that Form 1 truly does shine, with its raw and simplistic blade work that emphasize sweeping movements with continuous advancement towards the enemy, with the aim of cutting off the angles of the opponent. One of the best examples of Shi-Cho in action is during the episode of the Clone Wars, where Kit Fisto faces off against General Grievous in his lair, and showcases how effective Form 1 is when it comes to disarming your opponent, which Kit Fisto displays with ease, and against multiple opponents like battle droids, Kit Fisto would carve them up with ease due to his mastery of Shi-Cho. One of the clear weaknesses of Form 1 is when it came to facing single opponents. Even though against large amounts of enemies, Form 1 was the most ideal form, a great example of Form 1 not being ideal is of course in Kit Fisto's final battle in Revenge of the Sith, where against the onslaught of Darth Sidious's variant of Form 7, in combination with his Force Scream, Fisto could not compete with the Dark Lord. Despite his phenomenal skill in combat and power in the Force, his mastery of Form 1 held him back in being able to defend himself due to Form 1 allowing for the opponent to have complete mobility due to its lack of focus on single targets. But even with that being said, Fisto was able to last much longer compared to the other two Jedi that fell, that being Agen Kolar and Sezi Tin. So for that, Fisto should be commended. Overall, Form 1 is definitely an underrated form and is made way cooler by the master of the form, being the legendary Kit Fisto, with its emphasis on wild, raw and simplistic sweeping attacks with the ability to completely destroy multiple amounts of enemies and close off the angles with the intention of disarming opponents. And the reason why I haven't ranked this form any higher is due to the fact that against single targets, this form falls completely flat in comparison to the other forms on this list. Coming in at number 4, and arguably the flashiest style of lightsaber combat, is Form 4 Ataru, referred to as the Way of the Hawkbat, and commonly known as the Aggression form. Ataru was widely used during the era of the Old Republic, especially during the events of the Mandalorian Wars, where Ataru was the best form to use when dealing with Mandalorian opponents due to its speed, aggression, and acrobatics, which work best to disable Mandalorians quickly. And some of the most well-known practitioners of Form 4 includes Jedi Master Yoda, Obi-Wan during The Phantom Menace, Anakin during Attack of the Clones, and my personal favourite Star Wars character, Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn. Form 4, described by Sindralik as, and I quote, "Form 4, also called Ataru, is the most acrobatic form, filled with numerous elaborate moves, and relies heavily upon a Jedi's ability to run, jump, and spin using the Force." End quote. And Luke Skywalker in Legends describes Ataru as being, and I quote, "The Ataru form of combat is aggressive, but focused. You must never rely solely on skill with a weapon, but rather embrace the idea that your whole body is the weapon. Use the Force to spin, jump, to overpower your foe." End quote. Form 4 users above all else called upon the Force to flow through their bodies to aid in their movements and attacks, which in turn increased their speed and agility, which is why during Attack of the Clones, Master Yoda was able to hold his own against the Master Duelist Count Dooku. It's this connection to the Force that aids in Ataru's flashy style of incorporating acrobatics, somersaults, and backflips, for not only attacking but also to evade enemy attacks, which is why many Form 4 users preferred having room to move, since Ataru users needed to use their Force powers as a way to enhance their abilities in order to run, jump, and spin beyond normal physical capabilities. And it's through these high speeds that Form 4 allows for strong blows and spinning attacks from all directions, that is described as looking like a blur and flurry of attacks, which is best showcased in The Phantom Menace during the Duel of the Fates, where practitioners of Form 4 Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi take on Darth Maul's Form 7 in one of the best live-action fights in all of Star Wars, and as mentioned earlier, Yoda's fight against Count Dooku is another perfect example of Ataru in action. Before I move on to the weaknesses of Ataru, I would like to draw attention to another quote of Luke Skywalker's where he says, and I quote, "This style of fighting was taught to me by Master Yoda. In most cases, you will not use it as a first resort, but you'll find it often works as a last resort." End quote. And this quote by Luke is best showcased in the Obi-Wan Kenobi TV series, where for most of the last fight, Obi-Wan uses Form 3 against Darth Vader and loses in the first round, but in the second round he goes on the offensive against Vader and slices his helmet as a last resort, which ends up winning him the fight. And despite not being a fan of the show, I really like the connection and incorporation of Ataru in the way that Luke would have approached that fight. Some of the main weaknesses of Ataru include prolonged fights because of the constant flow of the Force that drains and fatigues the user, as well as confined spaces and multiple blaster-wielding enemies. And a great example of a prolonged fight and confined space is best showcased at the end of the Duel of the Fates, where Darth Maul overpowers Qui-Gon Jinn due to Ataru relying on attacking as its main form of defense. And it's because of the prolonged fight, confined space, and Darth Maul's onslaught of Form 7, he was able to break through Qui-Gon's relentless attacks with his own, that overpowered the Jedi Master, and it was after this fight where Obi-Wan was convinced to dedicate himself to Form 3, and even Anakin after his defeat at the hands of Count Dooku in the Attack of the Clones, chose to dedicate himself to Form 5, as even though Form 4 suited Anakin's aggressive personality, it lacked the ability to handle multiple opponents with ease, as well as take on a Form 2 user, which Form 5 is much better suited for. And fun little fact, even though Count Dooku loved Qui-Gon as a son, he despised Form 4 and Qui-Gon's use of it, as he found it to be too flashy without any substance. Overall, Ataru is definitely one of the most impressive and flashy forms, given that two of the best on-screen fights in Star Wars include Form 4, that being the Duel of the Fates and Yoda vs Count Dooku on Geonosis, which showcases the form's emphasis on Force-assisted acrobatics, speed, and agility, with flurries of attacks that are deadly against single opponents. And for me personally, I really love the flash of this form, and I did consider putting it higher on this list, but objectively I can't place it anywhere else due to its weaknesses of prolonged fights, confined spaces, and multiple opponents. And the best summary of Ataru is said by Obi-Wan, where he says, and I quote, "The best defense is a swift and decisive offense." End quote. Now we're down to the final three forms, and coming in at number 3 is Form 7, Vapad, which is the second variant of Form 7 that was created by Mace Windu to deal with his own inner darkness. But it's different enough in its application that I believe it deserves its own ranking on this list. Vapad is described as more of a state of mind than an actual fighting style, and some of the main practitioners of Vapad include Mace Windu, Quinlan Vos, and Depa Billaba, who Windu had instructed. Vapad is described by Mace Windu as being, and I quote, "I created Vapad to answer my weakness. It channels my own darkness into a weapon of the light. Vapad is more than a fighting style, it is a state of mind, a path that leads through the penumbra of the dark side. Form 7 is very aggressive, it can take the user very close to the dark side." End quote. Vapad, as Mace Windu says, was created as a way to channel the darkness of the practitioners that use it against their enemies. It took the tempered aggression of the Vapad form, along with the swifting flank technique, which is used to leap and jump around enemies to make quick and unpredictable strikes to catch enemies off guard. Basically, the Vapad user would accept the darkness of their opponent and turn it against them, which made this form very powerful in dueling situations. Anakin Skywalker said after watching Windu fight that his blade work appeared as an oblate sphere of purple fire, which explains how the blade work of Vapad uses appears unconnected, but is so fast and precise that it's near impossible to counter. Count Dooku even commented on Windu's use of Vapad by stating that the power of Vapad skirted close to the darkness, but was weak without the direct use of the dark side. Some great examples of Vapad in use is in Attack of the Clones when Windu made use of the form in order to overpower the Mandalorian bounty hunter Jango Fett. And of course, arguably the best example of Vapad was Windu being able to utilize his form to its fullest extent in Revenge of the Sith against Darth Sidious by turning his own anger, hate, and momentum against him, which is the perfect application of the form. When it comes to the weaknesses of this form, as Count Dooku stated, without the direct use of the dark side, you'll never be able to reach your full potential as a Force user, and since Vapad is a variant of Form 7, it also shares many of the same weaknesses, like not being effective against multiple enemies. Force users that didn't give in to their own darkness like Count Dooku would make the use of Vapad less effective. Vapad practitioners would also be exposed for giving themselves over to the Force in such a way, especially since Vapad skirts the boundaries of the Force, which can lead to arrogance, which in my opinion was a contributing factor in Windu's decisions, like in Tales of the Jedi with the way he got himself into the Jedi Council and his fateful decision to execute Darth Sidious. Overall, much like Juyo, Vapad is a badass form and style of lightsaber combat that is quite unique, and the ability to channel one's own inner darkness and turn the momentum of the enemy against them would be so useful in combat and dueling situations. And I personally did consider putting this form and variant at number 1, but the reasons why is because there isn't enough Vapad users to best judge how well it works compared to the other forms on this list. The focus on single targets holds it back, and if the opponent was in control of their emotions and use of the dark side like Count Dooku, it would make Vapad much less effective, which is why I rank it 3rd on my list. Coming in at number 2, and the most refined and elegant style of lightsaber combat is Form 2, Makashi, referred to as the Way of the Salamiri, commonly known as the Contention form. Makashi, above all other forms, was developed specifically for lightsaber to lightsaber combat and is arguably the most duelist oriented style of all 7 forms. The primary purpose of Form 2 was to serve as the polar opposite of Form 1, since Form 2 focuses heavily on precision swordplay, whereas Form 1 relies on sweeping movements and disarming, and Form 2 is best used to counter this style of combat. The most well-known practitioners of Form 2 include Jedi Master Shakti, Asajj Ventress, and Count Dooku, also known as Darth Tyrannus. Makashi is described by Qui-Gon Jinn and Count Dooku as, and I quote, "He is a fencer. Leverage, position, advantage. They are as natural to him as breathing." And Count Dooku says finesse, artfulness, economy, end quote. Darth Traya has a more balanced, if not negative view of Makashi, and she says, and I quote, "A technique that helps one resist the force attacks of an enemy, and is also excellent for lightsaber combat. It does more damage, but it leaves you vulnerable to other attacks. Use it against others wielding the force or lightsabers, but not against anyone else." End quote. Makashi is all about elegance, footwork, and focused blade work that prioritizes fluid movements, efficiency over power, and precision over strength. And it's because of this functionality that Form 2 style relied on jabs, light cuts, and parries, much like a fencer, and unlike the hacking, slashing, and blocking of the other 6 forms. A common characteristic of Makashi was that most users tended to make use of curved hilted lightsabers for more balance and blade manipulation, since the blade fits better in the user's hands and allows for precise strikes with one hand, which is a staple of Makashi's style. And some of the best examples of Makashi's fluid movements can be seen in the 2 lightsaber battles from Attack of the Clones, where Count Dooku easily outmaneuvers Obi-Wan's use of Soresu and prioritizes fluid movement against the much less inexperienced Anakin Skywalker. It's the later fight between Yoda and Dooku where the mastery of both Makashi and Ataru is on full display, and despite Master Yoda's power and skill, he is unable to break through the skill and efficiency of Dooku's mastery of Form 2. Another excellent example of Form 2's focus on footwork and positioning is during the excellent episode where through Count Dooku's skill, he decides to put the more attack-orientated Anakin on the defense and the more defense-orientated Obi-Wan on the attack. This is arguably one of the most clever lightsaber duels in the Clone Wars TV series, and is highly underrated for how well it showcases Count Dooku's footwork and positioning that truly displays how deadly Makashi is as a lightsaber form. Of course, Makashi isn't without its weaknesses. The main one being that since Makashi was designed for lightsaber combat and dueling, it lacked any way of defending against blaster fire and multiple enemies, which made it a very niche and limited form in its application. Dooku generally overcame this shortcoming by being strong in the Force and choosing his battles wisely, since it was quite rare to ever see him involved in open battle scenarios because of the limitation of his style of fighting. Overall, Makashi is arguably one of the best of the 7 forms, and tends to get overlooked the most due to its specialization in dueling. The focus on precision over strength with its fluid movement, footwork, and positioning in battle makes it ridiculously overpowered, especially in the hands of a master like Count Dooku. Of all the forms, I would argue this is the one I'm most biased about for how much I love Count Dooku's character and how he was brought to life by the legendary Sir Christopher Lee. For all the previous points I've stated, I do believe this form deserves the number 2 spot, but its weaknesses stop me from giving it the number 1 spot, as I do think there is a clear number 1 that's more deserving of top spot. Coming in at number 1 on my list, and my personal favourite lightsaber form, is Form 5 Gem So and its defensive variant of Xian, referred to as the Way of the Krayt Dragon and commonly known as the Perseverance form. Gem So was created specifically by Form 3 users that wanted to shorten the amount of time that was spent in combat by emphasizing powerful attacks with defensive capabilities that prioritize deadly counter-strikes. The Xian variant of Form 5 focused more on deflecting blaster fire and had less focus on blade-to-blade combat, but still incorporated the counter-strikes that were synonymous with the form. Some of the most well-known users of Form 5 include Plo Koon, Darth Bane, Luke Skywalker, and of course, Anakin Skywalker. Form 5's variants of Gem So and Xian are described by Sindralic as, and I quote, "One must question any discipline that has lethal potential. However, if it serves to suppress violent opposition and preserve peace, I believe it is a discipline worth knowing." Form 5's Gem So variation is devoted specifically to lightsaber dueling. With Xian, you will find it easier to deflect blaster fire with this form, and it shall also guard you against critical strikes by your opponents. End quote. Form 5 started as an amalgamation of the defensive tactics of Form 3 with the more aggressive nature of Form 2, which ended up evolving into the form that we all know and love. And above all others, this form required a high amount of physical strength to use and master, because of the complete domination of the user's enemies, and it's because of this that Form 5 is generally known as one of the most physically taxing of all 7 forms. Because the form prioritizes strength and domination of one's enemies, many Jedi consider the form to be a tad too aggressive and extreme. Regardless of this, many Jedi made use of this form, and especially the Xian variant. You even see the variants of Form 5 show up in other Star Wars media, like the reverse Xian grip being used by Galen Marek in Force Unleashed, and even in the earlier seasons of the Clone Wars, we see Ahsoka Tano making use of the reverse grip, which was common for Form 5 users that favoured Xian over Gem So. Gem So, on the other hand, is not as passive as Xian in its application, with Gem So focusing on brute strength, wide and powerful strikes combined with parries and counterattacks that were immediately followed up with overwhelming attacks used to press the advantage and completely dominate and penetrate an enemy's defenses. It's this sheer power and force enhanced strength that allowed a Form 5 user to overpower a combatant of any form. Even users of the dueling form of Makashi could be defeated by Form 5 users, and a perfect example of the application of Form 5 can be seen in the fight between Anakin Skywalker and Count Dooku in Revenge of the Sith, where even though Dooku's mastery of Makashi makes him essentially untouchable in combat, it's Anakin's mastery of Gem So that completely overwhelms Dooku's skills, with Anakin leaving little opening in his defenses with the constant attacks and counters that just prove too much for Count Dooku to handle. Interestingly, Form 5 has very few weaknesses when compared to the other 6 forms, which is a large reason why I place it first on my list as the best of all 7 lightsaber forms and their variants. Of course, the Xian variant of Form 5 is known to not be effective against single opponents, whereas Gem So's main weakness overall was its lack of mobility in combat, which is less of an issue when the user is skilled enough in the defensive aspect of the form. But it's still worth noting, as this weakness is what led to the downfall of Darth Vader in Return of the Jedi. Of course, he was half man, half machine by that point, which would explain his lack of mobility, but it's worth mentioning that Vader still employed his own version of Form 5, which, even though bolstered by the dark side and further knowledge of the other 6 forms, did him no favour in terms of his mobility, and poetically, his son defeated him with the very same form that he had mastered all those years ago. Overall, Gemso is, for very good reason, one of the best, and in my opinion, the definitive best lightsaber form of all time. Despite its main weakness being a lack of mobility, it pales in comparison to the strengths of this form, with the emphasis on brute strength, powerful strikes, parries, and a near perfect defense that encourages ripostes and counter-strikes to dominate and overwhelm an enemy. It's no wonder that two of the most powerful Force users in Star Wars Legends, that being Luke and Anakin Skywalker, were masters of Form 5, and were essentially unstoppable. And that comes to the end of this lore and ranking video of all 7 Star Wars lightsaber forms. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this breakdown and ranking of all the forms, and now I want to hear from you guys. Do you guys agree with my ranking? Would you guys have ranked the forms differently, or do you have a different view on the points I put forth? Either way, please let me know in the comments, and I want to say a massive thank you to my current and new channel members for supporting my content, as it's thanks to the support of you fine folks that allow me to do more content like this. And with that being said, that's all I've got for today. I hope you guys all have a wonderful day, and I'll be sure to catch you in the next one. Cheers.